A runaway mail-order bride disappeared without a word. This is the only way to keep you safe. The Texas sunset bled across the sky above the station, turning the dust to crushed gold and pulling the shadows long. Wind scraped over the wooden platform. It made the old station sign creak like a tired, forgotten prayer. Caleb Boone stood by a weathered post, rubbing the torn edge of a letter between his calloused fingers. The paper was soft from years of folding. He did not need to read the words anymore. Grief had a way of memorizing its own language. He had come for a wife because the silence had grown too large inside his empty house, too large inside him. He needed someone to anchor him to the living. Then the stagecoach rolled in through the haze. It stopped with a heavy groan of wheels and a breath of settling wood. For a moment, nothing moved. The desert waited. The heavy door opened. She stepped down carefully, one gloved hand gripping the iron frame. Her dress was stained with the grime of travel, the hem powdered with miles of road dust. But her back remained straight. Too straight. Like she had learned a long time ago that bending only made the blow land harder. In her other hand was a white handkerchief, clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone pale under the fabric. Caleb caught the stitched initials before she lowered it against her skirt. E.H. He watched her the way a man watches a distant storm, unsure whether to wait for the rain or ride the other way. "You have come a very long way," he said, his voice rough from disuse, "just to meet a man you have never seen." She did not answer at once. Her eyes drifted past his shoulder, out toward the empty, darkening stretch of land behind the station. "There are distances," she said quietly, her voice steady but hollow, "that are easier to cross than staying where you belong." Before Caleb could reply, a gunshot cracked. It echoed from somewhere far beyond the northern fields. She flinched. It was a small movement, quick, but it was not the kind born from sudden surprise. It was recognition. For one sharp second, genuine terror flashed through her eyes, like an animal bolting through the brush. Then it was gone, buried instantly beneath that same careful, practiced stillness. Caleb said nothing. He did not move. But as the wind pushed the red dust between them, one thought settled cold and heavy in his chest. The woman who had come to be his wife was not just running from her past. She was being hunted by it. The wedding took exactly 10 minutes. There was no music, no white lace, no family to weep or celebrate. There was only a tired pastor in a dusty church, a man who smelled of stale whiskey and read the holy vows like he was reading a ledger of debts.
"I take thee, Eliza."
Caleb said the words to a woman who did not look at him. Eliza made her promises to a cracked floorboard she had been staring at since she walked through the door. It was not a union of two souls. It was a cold transaction of survival. They returned to the ranch before nightfall. The house was a weathered structure of dark wood, sitting lonely and stubborn under the vast Texas sky. Inside, the air felt heavy. It smelled of dry earth, old coffee, and a lingering grief Eliza did not yet understand. They began their life together, but they lived it like two parallel lines drawn in the dirt, always side by side, but never touching. Caleb kept to his fences. Eliza kept to the chores. But from the corners of his eyes, Caleb watched her. He watched the way she moved. A mail-order bride from the refined East was supposed to be fragile, soft-handed, hesitant around the brutal edges of the frontier. Eliza was none of those things. She did not complain about the blistering heat. She chopped firewood with clean, unbroken strikes. She drew heavy buckets of water without ever pausing to catch her breath. She worked with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. Too skilled, too silent. One evening, They sat across from each other at the rough-hewn dining table. A single oil lamp flickered between them. It cast long, restless shadows that danced against the log walls. The silence in the room was thicker than the pitch-black night pressing against the windows. Caleb set his fork down. He looked at the woman who now shared his name, but nothing else. "You never ask questions," he said. His deep voice seemed to startle the shadows, but not her. Eliza did not stop wiping the table. She did not even look up. "Because answers do not change what is already done," she replied softly. Her voice was completely devoid of curiosity. It was flat, resigned, and heavy. It was the voice of a woman who had already seen too much of the ugly side of the world. But the true crack in her careful facade did not come from her words. It came 3 nights later. Caleb returned to the cabin earlier than usual. The front door creaked open, the sound swallowed by a sudden gust of wind. He stopped in the narrow hallway. Through the slight opening of the bedroom door, he saw her. Eliza was sitting on the edge of the bed. The dim moonlight spilled over her shoulders. In her lap, resting gently on her pristine white handkerchief, was a heavy Colt revolver. She had pulled it from beneath her pillow. Caleb held his breath. The eyes staring down at the weapon were not the eyes of a frightened, displaced bride. They were sharp, cold, calculating. She wiped the oil from the dark barrel with the steady, practiced hands of someone who knew the exact weight of iron and death. Caleb backed away into the shadows. He said nothing. He asked nothing. But the very next morning, that lingering suspicion hardened into a dangerous certainty. They were walking near the edge of the property line, checking a broken post, when the brush suddenly rustled. A rabbit bolted from the dry grass. It was fast, a frantic blur of brown fur darting toward the rocks. Before Caleb could even reach for the rifle slung across his back, Eliza moved. It was not a conscious decision. It was pure muscle memory. She drew the revolver from the folds of her skirt, raised her arm, and fired in one fluid, breathless motion. The rabbit dropped instantly. A perfect shot, one single bullet. The sharp echo of the gunshot rolled across the empty plains, bouncing off the distant canyon before the wind swallowed it whole. Eliza lowered the smoking gun. Her chest rose and fell sharply. She realized a second too late what she had just revealed. Slowly, she turned her head to look at him. Caleb stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the barrel of her gun. An innocent Eastern girl looking for a fresh start did not hold a weapon like that. A woman who shot with that kind of deadly precision was not looking for a quiet home. She was preparing for a war. The days bled into weeks, and the jagged edges between them began to dull. It was not a sweeping romance. The Wild West did not afford such luxuries, but the quiet language of shared survival. The oppressive silence gave way to small, unspoken gestures. A fresh pot of coffee simmering on the iron stove, a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders as she slept by the fire. Caleb's gaze softened. The cold suspicion in his eyes was eclipsed by something far more dangerous, a lingering, heavy look tracking the curve of her neck when he thought she wasn't watching. On the porch at night, the space between them felt less like a barricade and more like a bridge they were terrified to cross. And then there was her name, Eliza. At first, he avoided it entirely. When he finally said it, it sounded like gravel in his mouth. But lately, it slipped past his lips effortlessly, a low, steady rumble that made her chest tighten. She was beginning to crave it. She was starting to want the very thing she swore she did not deserve. A home, and a man who looked at her like she was worth protecting. But ghosts do not rest easily in Texas dirt. The midday sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, The air shimmered with suffocating heat above the small family graveyard tucked behind the ranch. Scorched grass crunched beneath Eliza's boots as she pushed open the rusted iron gate. Beneath the skeletal branches of a lone oak tree lay 3 graves. 2 were old, weathered blind by decades of wind. The third was different. It was newer, cared for. Eliza stopped in front of it. Kneeling, the heavy fabric of her skirt pooled in the dust. Her gloved fingers reached out, gently brushing away the red dirt settled deep into the carved letters of the headstone. She read the name, Mary Boone. Eliza's breath hitched violently. The searing summer air suddenly felt too cold to breathe. Mary Boone. The name echoed in the dark, locked chambers of her memory. Her eyes frantically traced the date of death carved into the granite. It was the exact day, month, and year of the Valley Raid. The raid she had mapped out for the Blackwood gang, the one she was promised would only be a simple robbery of an empty ranch. Her hands shook uncontrollably. The pristine white handkerchief, embroidered with E.H., slipped from her trembling grasp onto the unforgiving earth. "I hope someone loved you enough to make you want to stay," Eliza whispered. Her voice cracked, buckling under the weight of suffocating dread. She was talking to the stone, but crying for herself. She did not have a choice. Caleb's voice cut through the blistering heat like the crack of a whip. Eliza froze, her blood turning to ice. She hadn't heard his boots on the dry grass. He stood a few paces behind her, an inescapable shadow blocking out the glaring sun. His eyes were fixed on the headstone, completely stripped of the fragile warmth that had grown between them. "She died because someone pointed the way for them," Caleb said, his words falling like lead weights onto her chest. "A secret sold for coin. They knew exactly when I would be gone, where the rifles were kept. They slaughtered her because someone drew them a map." Every word was a rusted nail driven into Eliza's coffin. She stood slowly, knees weak, unable to turn around and look him in the eye. The solid ground beneath her feet felt as though it was crumbling into a bottomless gorge. The terrifying truth crashed down like a judge's final gavel. The man whose worn shirts she washed, whose calloused hands she had begun to crave in the dark, whose shattered heart she was trying to piece back together, was the ultimate victim of her own unforgivable sin. The blood of the innocent woman buried beneath her boots permanently stained her hands. This ranch was not her sanctuary. It was her execution block. The fragile love taking root in her chest withered and died in an instant, replaced by cold, absolute terror. When the sky finally breaks in this unforgiving stretch, it punishes the earth. The storm hammered against the corrugated tin roof of the cabin, a deafening echo of the panic rising in Eliza's chest. Water lashed against the glass, blurring the dark world outside. Inside, the air was thick with damp wool and burning oak. Eliza sat by the hearth, her needle moving rhythmically over a torn shirt, though her hands trembled. From the shadows, Caleb watched her, running an oiled cloth over his Winchester rifle. The sharp click of the lever action was swallowed by the roaring storm. The suffocating silence of their arranged marriage had morphed into a charged, electric quiet, the sound of 2 lonely survivors, realizing they no longer wanted to survive alone. Caleb studied how the firelight softened her guarded features. A man who had sworn he would never let anyone close enough to leave a scar, he now felt an undeniable, terrifying pull toward the woman by his fire. But for Eliza, this newfound tenderness was an agonizing poison. Every protective look tightened the invisible noose of guilt around her neck. She was falling deeply in love with a man whose world she had destroyed. The memory of the graveyard, Mary Boone etched in cold stone, screamed louder than the thunder. She was a thief, stealing warmth from a fire she had no right to sit beside. Caleb set his rifle aside. His heavy boots crossed the floorboards before he knelt beside her chair. The sudden proximity caught Eliza's breath. Slowly, Caleb reached out. His calloused fingers gently covered her trembling hand, stopping the frantic movement of the needle. It was the very first time he had touched her with a purpose other than necessity. Eliza pulled back as if burned, her chest rising rapidly. She could not look into his eyes, knowing she would completely shatter. "You do not know who I am," Eliza whispered, her voice a fragile thing barely rising above the storm. Caleb remained still, his intense gaze anchoring her. "I know the woman sitting in front of me." Eliza shook her head, a desperate movement of denial. The crushing weight of her secret suffocated her. "If you knew everything about me," she said, her voice trembling, "you would not let me stay." Firelight cast restless shadows across Caleb's weathered face. He saw the profound terror in her eyes, a woman fully expecting to be cast into the freezing dark. He did not know what demons chased her, but he knew he was not ready to let her go. Caleb leaned forward, his voice a low, unyielding rumble slicing through the rain. "Then do not give me a reason to ask." It was a dangerous, fragile truce. An unspoken agreement to bury the past beneath the floorboards and pray it never dug its way out. But the past never stays buried in the Wild West. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon. Through the water-streaked window pane, the darkness was absolute. Then, a jagged flash of lightning tore the sky open, illuminating the desolate yard for one blinding fraction of a second. Standing perfectly still beyond the wooden fence was a silhouette. A dark, imposing figure in a wide-brimmed hat and a rain-heavy duster coat. He was not seeking shelter. He was staring directly at the glowing window of the cabin. The past had finally found her. The border town of Oak Haven was not a place for salvation. It was where desperate people went to disappear. The midday sun baked the wooden storefronts, turning the dusty main street into a suffocating furnace. The air tasted of sulfur, cheap whiskey, and dried sweat. There was no romance on the frontier, only brutal survival. And today, the town felt particularly hostile. Eliza walked out of the general store, wrapping her arms around a heavy burlap sack of flour. She kept her head down, the wide brim of her bonnet shielding her face from the glaring light and the lingering stares of drunken ranch hands outside the saloon. She just wanted to get back to the wagon, back to the quiet isolation of the ranch, back to Caleb. But as she turned into the narrow, shadowed alleyway where their horses were tied, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The rhythmic, heavy clink of silver spurs echoed off the brick walls. A man stepped out from the deep shadows, completely blocking her path. He wore a dust-caked duster coat, and the pungent smell of stale tobacco and gun oil hit her lungs before he even spoke. Eliza froze. Her grip on the burlap sack tightened until her knuckles ached. It was Vance, the ruthless leader of the Blackwood gang, the ghost who had held her leash for years. He tilted his worn hat back, revealing a jagged scar and a smile that held absolutely no warmth. "Well, look at you," Vance drawled, his voice a low, gravelly sneer. "All cleaned up and playing house." Eliza could not breathe. The alley walls seemed to close in, crushing her chest. She took a slow, calculated step backward, but two armed men stepped out from behind a stack of crates, silently cutting off her escape. Vance stepped closer, invading her space. He grabbed her chin with a rough, calloused hand, forcing her to look into his dead, obsidian eyes. "You really planning on playing the dutiful wife, Eliza?" he whispered, his breath hot and foul. "After you already bathed in his family's blood?" The burlap sack slipped from her trembling hands, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. Flour exploded in a thick white cloud around their boots. "Leave him out of this," Eliza managed to say, her voice shaking but laced with a desperate venom. I am out. I left the gang." Vance laughed, a dry, humorless sound that chilled her to the bone. "Nobody leaves, little bird," he said, drawing a heavy hunting knife and lazily dragging the flat of the cold blade against her pale cheek. "You mapped out the Boone Ranch for us once. But you forgot to tell us he had a hidden safe beneath the floorboards. We want what is inside." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a lethal threat. "You are going to finish the job. Open that back door for us tonight. If you do not," Vance smiled, showing yellowed teeth, "we will ride out there and burn that beautiful ranch to the ground, and we will skin your new husband alive while you watch." He released her abruptly, letting her stumble back against the rough brick wall. "Midnight, Eliza. Leave the door unlatched, or Caleb Boone dies." Vance turned and walked away, his men following like loyal hounds. The ominous sound of his spurs slowly faded into the noise of the busy street. Eliza slid down the brick wall, collapsing into the spilled flour. Her entire world fractured into sharp, jagged pieces. The fragile hope she had been quietly building shattered completely. She finally understood the cruel, inescapable truth. Her very presence was a death sentence for Caleb. The man she loved was marked for the grave simply because he had let her into his home. If she stayed and fought, Caleb would die. The gang was too large, too ruthless. There was only one way to keep him breathing. She had to destroy his trust. She had to make him hate her. Eliza looked down at her, shaking hands, realizing with terrifying clarity what she had to do. She had to become the villain he thought she was. She had to betray him one last time, just to save his life. The Texas night was a sprawling, suffocating ocean of absolute black. There was no moon, no stars to offer guidance. There was only the heavy, oppressive silence of the prairie. Until the match was struck. The sharp hiss of sulfur breaking the quiet was immediately followed by a blinding flare of yellow. Eliza stood in the center of the wooden stable, the heavy scent of kerosene burning her nostrils. At her feet, the dry hay was soaked in the volatile liquid. Her hand trembled violently. This was the sanctuary where she had first felt safe. This was the timber he had cut with his own hands. And she was about to turn it into ash. She opened her fingers. The small flame dropped. The fire did not just ignite. It exploded. It roared to life with a deafening whoosh, immediately climbing the wooden beams like a starving, feral beast. The blazing light washed over Eliza's face, illuminating the tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. The heat blistered against her skin, a physical reflection of the agony tearing her chest apart. She turned her back to the inferno. She swung herself into the saddle of the one horse she had kept outside, digging her heels into its flanks. She rode out into the pitch-black night. She forced her eyes forward, locking her jaw against the sob clawing at her throat. She did not look back. If she looked back, she knew she would stay. And if she stayed, he would die. Back at the ranch, the heavy scent of smoke finally seeped through the cracks of the cabin windows. Caleb woke with a violent jolt. The frantic, high-pitched screaming of the trapped horses cut through the night like a physical blade. He threw off the woolen blankets, sprinting out the front door into a nightmare. The stable was a towering inferno, the red flames violently licking the black sky, sending a storm of glowing embers swirling into the dark. "Eliza!" Caleb roared, his voice tearing at his vocal cords. Pure, blinding panic seized him. He did not think of the property. He did not think of the animals. He only thought of the woman who had become his entire world. He grabbed a heavy canvas tarp from the water trough, throwing the soaked fabric over his head and shoulders as he plunged straight into the blistering heat of the doorway. The smoke was a thick, choking wall. He kicked the stall doors open, driving the terrified horses out into the open night, his eyes stinging and streaming as he searched the burning shadows. Eliza, answer me. Nothing. Only the deafening crackle of collapsing timber. Driven back by a falling, burning beam, Caleb stumbled out into the yard, gasping for oxygen, his lungs burning. She wasn't there. A new, chilling thought struck him. She must still be in the cabin. He ran back to the main house, kicking the bedroom door open. The room was illuminated by the violent orange glow bleeding through the window pane. The bed was empty. Caleb stopped. His chest heaved as his soot-stained eyes darted across the room. The doors of the heavy wooden wardrobe were left wide open. The few dresses she owned were gone. The leather satchel she had arrived with was missing. The frantic, desperate panic pumping through his veins suddenly froze, crystallizing into a cold, terrifying dread. This was no accident. The fire had not trapped her. It was a distraction. A calculated, deliberate abandonment. His eyes fell upon the rustic wooden table. There, pinned beneath a single iron bullet, was a piece of paper. It was jagged, hastily torn straight down the middle, leaving only a fragment of her elegant handwriting. Caleb walked over, his boots heavy as lead. He picked it up with shaking, ash-covered fingers. He read the broken sentences illuminated by the firelight of his burning livelihood. I am the one who set the fire. I have wronged you. This is the only way to keep you safe. Caleb stared at the ink. His mind violently rejected the contradiction. The woman who had slept in his bed, the woman whose quiet smiles had slowly mended his shattered soul, had just burned his world down and vanished into the dark. He slowly lowered the paper. A low, dark sound rumbled deep within his chest. It was not a sob. It was a laugh. It was a bitter, hollow, broken laugh that scraped against the back of his throat like shattered glass. He dropped to his knees right there in the center of the room, surrounded by the ghosts of his ruined life. The mocking laughter mixed with the violent crackling of the fire outside. Burn my home to the ground, Caleb whispered to the empty room, his voice dripping with absolute freezing venom. And tell me it was to keep me safe? Pathetic. His large hand closed into a fist, violently crushing the torn letter. He had buried one wife. He had spent years grieving. But as he looked at the flames reflecting in the window glass, Caleb Boone made a final, unbreakable vow. He would never, ever mourn a traitor again. The air in the desolate canyon was thick with the scent of cold ashes and impending death. Caleb Boone stood in the center of the gang's recently abandoned camp. The wind howled through the jagged, towering rocks of the Narrows, a natural trap of dead ends and sheer drops in the unforgiving Wild West. His heavy boot struck something hidden beneath a charred piece of canvas, a rusted tin box. Caleb knelt and pried the lid open with his hunting knife. Inside lay a few stolen silver coins and a crumpled, dirt-stained piece of paper. His heart hammered violently against his ribs as he immediately recognized the elegant, hurried handwriting. With shaking hands, Caleb pulled the torn fragment he had found at the ranch from his coat pocket. He laid the two pieces together on the cold stone. The jagged edges aligned perfectly. The broken, damning sentences suddenly transformed into a terrifying confession. I am the one who set the fire, because Vance was coming to burn it with you inside. I have wronged you, but I am leading them into the deep narrows where they cannot escape. This is the only way to keep you safe. And then, at the very bottom, were the words that shattered Caleb's hardened soul into 1,000 jagged pieces. I did not know it was your wife in that house years ago. If I had known, I swear to you, Caleb, I would have died instead of her. Do not follow me. Let the canyon take us all. The paper slipped from his numb fingers. The bitter laughter of his supposed betrayal turned to ash in his mouth. She had not run away to save herself. She had turned herself into bait. Eliza was walking straight into a slaughterhouse, offering her own life to pay a debt she could never afford, just to draw the wolves away from his door. He had spent days hating a traitor, only to realize he was about to lose the only woman who had ever truly tried to save his soul. Caleb vaulted onto his horse, driving his spurs in hard. He rode straight toward the valley of death. The sky above Red Canyon was bruised with the color of spilled blood. Dust swirled through the jagged stone corridors, carried by a wind that howled like a dying animal. Eliza leaned heavily against the cold sandstone, her breath rattling in her chest. Dark crimson soaked through the torn fabric of her left shoulder. Surrounding her were the broken bodies of 3 outlaws. She had used their own arrogant habits against them, slipping a blade between the ribs of the first in the shadows, and gunning down the other 2 in a breathless, desperate crossfire. Then, a long, dark shadow stretched across the blood-stained gravel. Caleb Boone materialized from the settling dust, a silent ghost atop his weary horse. He did not dismount immediately. He simply sat there, staring down at the bleeding woman who had lied to him, betrayed him, and burned his world just to keep him breathing. Eliza did not flinch under his gaze. Slowly, her trembling fingers reached for the heavy Colt at her hip. She drew the weapon, but she did not raise the barrel. Instead, she flipped the gun, wrapping her bloody fingers around the hot steel cylinder, and extended the wooden grip toward Caleb. Her eyes, once constantly searching for an escape, were finally still. It was an absolute, terrifying surrender. She was not asking for mercy. She was offering her life to end the relentless cycle of her guilt. "You deserve to decide what happens to me," Eliza whispered, her voice scraping against the dry wind. "Because I already decided once, and it cost you everything." Caleb swung down from the saddle. His boots crunched against the loose gravel. He stepped into her space and took the heavy revolver from her offered hand. Slowly, deliberately, he raised the barrel until the black iron rested dead center against her forehead. His calloused finger curled around the trigger. He applied pressure. In the span of a single heartbeat, a violent storm of memories flashed behind his eyes, the weathered headstone of Mary Boone. Eliza's rare, unguarded laugh echoing through the timber stable. The jagged, tear-stained ink screaming, "This is the only way to keep you safe." Caleb's chest heaved. The iron sights trembled. Then, he slowly lowered the gun. The metallic click of the hammer sliding back into place echoed loudly against the rocks. "If I pull this trigger," Caleb rasped, his voice raw with the weight of a decade of grief, "I lose what little I have left of myself." He was not offering forgiveness. He was simply refusing to become the monster the past wanted him to be. Before the heavy truth of his words could settle, the scrape of boots on stone shattered the quiet. Behind Caleb, atop a jagged ridge, a 4th figure rose, Vance. His duster coat was soaked in his own blood from Eliza's earlier shot, but a leveled Winchester rifle was pressed against his shoulder. There was no time for words. Caleb lunged, tackling Eliza hard into the dirt behind a massive boulder, just as a bullet pulverized the rock where they had stood. For the very first time, they did not hide from each other. They moved as one. Eliza scrambled up the incline, drawing a hidden derringer from her boot, firing blindly to pin Vance down and cover Caleb's blind side. Caleb rolled out of the dirt, cocking his lever-action rifle in one fluid, flawless motion, and fired a single, deafening shot. Vance collapsed, plunging backward off the ridge into the dark abyss. The gunfire ceased. The oppressive silence of the canyon rushed back in, leaving only the sound of the relentless wind. Caleb stood up, wiping the grit from his face. He walked over to Eliza, holding out the Colt. He placed the heavy iron back into her bloody palm. "If you stay," Caleb said, his voice stripped of both anger and affection, "it will not erase anything." He held her gaze in the dying light. "But it means you are finally done running." It was a brutal, honest truth. No sweeping romance, just a brutal choice to face the wreckage together. Eliza looked down at the gun, then back at the man who refused to be her executioner. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply stepped past him, her boots walking a slow, agonizing path toward the distant, flickering lantern light of the ruined ranch. Caleb remained in the deep shadows, watching her back until the darkness swallowed them both. She didn't stay because she was forgiven. She stayed because she finally stopped running. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more Wild West love stories. Tell me in the comments, can a broken foundation ever hold a new life? Or is their love just another tragedy waiting to happen?